The assassination of President John F. Kennedy is one of the most discussed events in American history. And although the story has been told and retold ever since, there are plenty of fascinating tidbits that have been largely overlooked along the way. The story of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy arguably begins way back in December of 1960, after his election but before he took the oath of office. Why? Because that was when the first attempt was made on his life. While it was Lee Harvey Oswald who would later gain notoriety as the official assassin, it was a 73-year-old former postal worker and New Hampshire resident named Richard Paul Pavlik who first tried to murder JFK. And he was pretty serious about it. Pavlik went to a hardware store and purchased dynamite, detonation cord, a trigger switch, a battery, and exploding caps. He ended up following the Kennedy family to Palm Beach and staked out their vacation home with his car full of explosives. The idea was that he was going to ram Kennedy's car and send them both to meet the makers, but he didn't end up going through with it. When he saw Jackie Kennedy get into the car with Caroline and John Jr., he called it off. Pavlik was ultimately arrested before he could make another attempt. It soon became clear that he'd been following the Kennedys for a while. He had sent a series of postcards to his hometown's postmaster general, who became concerned and alerted authorities. Rather than stand trial, Pavlik was found legally insane and was committed to a mental institution, where he remained until 1966. Did he not have a change of heart and detonated it? There was little we could have done. When Time reported on the attempt, they quoted Pavlik's explanation as to why he'd been so determined to kill the president-elect. The Kennedy money bought him the White House. I wanted to teach the United States the presidency is not for sale. The blame for Kennedy's assassination would be placed squarely on Lee Harvey Oswald. Without getting into the controversy behind that, it's worth mentioning that it apparently wasn't the first time Oswald decided to further his political agenda by killing someone he thought was standing in the way. Who was that? A U.S. Army general named Edwin Walker. Walker was a pretty controversial figure at the time, known for his extreme right-wing views, including calling for the assassination of Fidel Castro. Journalist and author Bill Minutaglio says that's where Oswald came in. It's presumed that Oswald saw Walker as an immediate threat to his beloved communist regime. So on April 10, 1963, he set himself up behind a fence near Walker's home, and at 9 p.m. found himself with a pretty perfect shot at the general. He fired one shot but missed completely, sending the general running outside after the would-be assassin. Oswald, however, got away clean. And here's where there's one of those weird things that, in hindsight, can be pointed at as having the potential to have changed history. Even though the Dallas police were convinced that the shot fired at Walker had been a deliberate assassination attempt, they had no suspect. In his book, Dallas, 1963, Minutaglio says, some people have criticized the investigation of the Walker assassination attempt. They say if it had been a truly deep and thorough investigation, then Oswald would have been arrested and imprisoned and JFK would have lived. If it hadn't been for the assassination, President John F. Kennedy's time in Texas would have been standard stuff. There was a whirlwind tour of 5 Texas cities scheduled over 2 days, and according to Jeb Byrne, a member of JFK's General Services Administration, he had been sent ahead to start planning things about 10 days before the president got there. In a written recollection preserved in the National Archives, Byrne wrote about how the idea behind the trip was to help cement loyalties ahead of an announcement officially kicking off his re-election campaign. Byrne wrote about having nightmarishly busy days. By the time President Kennedy got to Fort Worth, Byrne remembered the thousands of cheering spectators, a rainy, overcast day, and seeing Jacqueline Kennedy wearing that famous pink suit for the first time. She stepped into the kitchen to greet the staff of the hotel where they would be having breakfast. The Kennedys were charming, speeches were given, and then they had some downtime. Gosh, there were just so much clapping and applause, just people waving, and they seemed like they were happy. Before leaving for Dallas, Byrne says the Kennedys took in an art exhibit. Also, JFK called FDR's former vice president to wish him a happy birthday. And when he read the morning paper, he noticed an ad that had been placed by right-wing extremists that suggested the president was a threat to the nation's security. And at this, Byrne wrote, Kennedy mused out loud at this point about how easy it would be to assassinate a traveling president. Then they took off for Dallas. Everyone's familiar with the scene. The presidential motorcade rolls down the street in Dallas, gunshots ring out, and chaos descends. But Secret Service agent Clint Hill saw it from a different angle. He had a front row seat to the horror, and his life was never the same. Hill told NPR's Radio Diaries, before Dallas I was known as just Clint Hill. After that, I've been known as the man who climbed onto the president's car. At 6-second period in Dallas. It's not an easy thing to live with. Hill was officially in charge of protecting not JFK, but Jackie Kennedy. He said that in the first instance, no one was sure what had happened. At first, he thought he'd heard firecrackers, and it was only when he saw the president fall that he realized what was taking place. Hill had been riding in the car behind the president. When he realized the president was shot, he ran forward, jumped on the trunk of the Kennedy's car, pushed the first lady back into the seat, and shielded the couple as the car sped off. Bill says that the instant it happened, he knew there was no chance the president would survive. He recalled that in the weeks before the assassination, JFK and Jackie had reconnected over a shared tragedy, the death of their son, Patrick. Patrick died when he was just 2 days old, and Hill believed that was why Jackie had broken from a long-standing tradition and decided to join her husband on his trip to Dallas. Here's where things start to get really murky. President Kennedy was rushed to Dallas's Parkland Hospital, and it's safe to say that's pretty much the only thing everyone agrees on. But let's take a look at the testimony of some of the people who were there, starting with Ronald Jones. Jones was the hospital's chief resident, and he's spoken about what happened in the 12 minutes between Kennedy being rushed into the trauma center and being declared dead.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today
here in Dallas. Among his most vivid memories were those of Jackie Kennedy. Jones recalls her handing a piece of JFK's skull and brain to one of the doctors who had answered the emergency call. He also recalled the president's eyes.
He was motionless. His eyes were open. I never saw any movement during the time we were evaluating him.
Jones says that although doctors initially began trying to save the president's life, once they saw the wound in his head, they knew there was no chance. 12 minutes later, he was face-to-face with FBI agents and decided he wasn't going to be the one who told them the president was dead.
He died of gunshot wound in the brain.
Parkland doctors have also added something to the official narrative that makes it not so straightforward. When several of them were interviewed for the documentary, JFK What the Doctors Saw, Doctors Jim Jenkins, Robert Tannenbaum, Malcolm Perry, and Robert McClelland all testified that they had seen an entrance wound on JFK's throat. It's understandable how there could be varying accounts about the way the events of the Kennedy assassination actually happened. Take the story of Paul Landis. He was one of the Secret Service agents who was there that day, and it took him until 2023 to share his side of the story. Interestingly, it involved the so-called magic bullet theory. One of the biggest questions about that day is how the same bullet could have hit President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally Jr. repeatedly. Landis claimed that his timeline of the events cleared all that up. Kind of. Contrary to the official reports that describe a bullet being found on a stretcher after Connally was taken to Parkland, Landis says that with no one on hand to secure the crime scene, the limousine, he did. Sort of. Landis told the New York Times that he plucked a bullet from the back of Connally's seat, put it on the stretcher next to Kennedy, and then it's anyone's guess.
People were pushing and shoving, and I just got shoved right up against the examination table.
The way Landis tells it, all the agents that were there were focused on the president. This was all going on so quickly, and I was just afraid that it was a piece of evidence. That I realized right away. Very important, and I didn't want it to disappear or get lost. So it was, Paul, you've got to make a decision, and I grabbed it. Even as President Kennedy, still alive, was rushed to the hospital only to be pronounced dead 12 minutes later, law enforcement scrambled to figure out what the heck just happened and apprehend the guilty parties. What happened to Oswald immediately after the assassination has been put together piece by piece. First, he headed back to the Oak Cliff rooming house where he'd been staying, grabbed a gun, then fled. All of Dallas was looking for someone fitting Oswald's description, and it was in Oak Cliff that Oswald was confronted by Officer J.D. Tippit. About 45 minutes after Kennedy was shot, Oswald shot and killed Tippit. Oswald then fled the scene and headed into the Texas theater. And here's a fun fact for the next trivia night. The movie that was playing when he snuck into the theater was called War is Hell, and it doesn't exist anymore. Not in its entirety, at least. Employees of the theater ended up turning Oswald in, and he was arrested by Dallas police. Strangely, some of the clearest photos of that arrest were taken by a freelance photographer named James McCammon, but they weren't published until they appeared in Time about 3 months after the assassination. They show Oswald being dragged out of the theater, moments after punching one officer and then trying to shoot him. It took just under 80 minutes after the assassination for him to be apprehended. Then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was also part of the motorcade, and it was a full 15 minutes after the fatal shots were fired that Johnson learned he had become the next POTUS. It was just 98 minutes later that he was officially sworn in. Before that, however, Johnson made a phone call to the Attorney General to find out just what the heck he was supposed to be doing. Unfortunately for him, that Attorney General was the late president's brother, Robert Kennedy. Still, the show must go on in the face of shock, grief, and tragedy, and Robert Kennedy told him everything he needed to know for an emergency inauguration aboard Air Force One, even as it carried President Kennedy's body back to Washington, D.C. Everyone's seen those iconic photos, but there are a few fascinating things about that moment that often get overlooked. The person doing the swearing in was Texas federal judge Sarah Hughes. Judge Hughes became the first woman to swear in a U.S. president, and it had been Johnson who pressured Robert Kennedy for her installment in that position a few years prior. Kennedy thought she was too old, not to mention female, but Johnson got his way. Although it would make sense to think Johnson was sworn in on JFK's personal Bible, the book wasn't a Bible at all. It was a Catholic missal that disappeared for a while before being rediscovered and given to the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library and Museum. Former Secret Service agent Clint Hill was a person tasked with arranging a casket to transport the president's body from Parkland Hospital back to Washington, D.C. In the documentary series JFK, One Day in America, he recalled that Mrs. Kennedy famously refused to change her clothes. And much later, when she sat down with a journalist from Life, Mrs. Kennedy recalled instantly regretting her decision to wash the blood from her face, saying, "1 second later I thought, why did I wash the blood off? I should have left it there, let them see what they've done." When Air Force One arrived in D.C., photos were taken and the president's body was transferred to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Mrs. Kennedy was still wearing the blood-stained pink suit, which would later end up in the National Archives. It wasn't until the president's casket was installed in the East Room that she finally changed. Jackie Kennedy's journey was also witnessed by Peace Corps press officer David Pearson, who was temporarily filling in for missing White House staffers. He published his memoirs of that day 20 years after it happened. By chance, he was there to witness everything that happened inside the White House out of the public eye. In his self-published memoir, JFK and Bobby, Arnie and Jack and David, The Unusual PR Career of David Pearson, he recalled seeing Mrs. Kennedy walk in.
She had on that pink suit, and there were these chocolate-looking stains all over the front, where his head had lain.
He wrote about watching her kneel beside her dead husband's casket, alone with her deep personal grief, sharing, "She kneels there like that for what seems like a long time, but it must span no more than 2 or 3 minutes. There's dead silence. I'm almost afraid to breathe. Slowly, she starts to rise, and without any warning, Mrs. Kennedy begins crying." When President Kennedy's body arrived back on the East Coast, he was taken to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, for an autopsy about which discrepancies have been fueling conspiracy theories ever since. A 1998 piece in the Washington Post laid out some of the issues, including the fact that no one is entirely sure when or how many times his brain was examined. And as for that brain, it was removed, then given to someone from Senator Robert Kennedy's camp in 1965. And when autopsy materials were collected the following year for inclusion in the National Archives, the president's brain was missing.
Certain people in our government tampered with critical evidence in order to make sure the American people would not know the truth about who murdered the president.
When investigative reporter Philip Sheenan was working on his book, A Cruel and Shocking Act, his research raised more questions. He told NPR that Chief Justice Earl Warren forbade the release of autopsy photos, even to those working as part of the Warren Commission. Instead, they too were given to Robert Kennedy. Meanwhile, the pathologist in charge of the autopsy burned all the documentation that day after the procedure was done. When asked why, he said the pages had blood on them. Forensic pathologist Werner Spitz has worked on the Kennedy case at various times over the years, beginning in 1975 when he was called as an expert witness. He told USA Today that, in his expert opinion, there were so many things that were done wrong it was pretty much impossible to count them all, and summed it up like this: they botched that autopsy. They had absolutely no experience in forensic pathology. When Jackie Kennedy was told that Lee Harvey Oswald had been arrested, she responded, "He didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights. It had to be some silly little communist."
No, so I'm not a communist, and I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous.
At the time, the idea that the world might descend into the nightmare of nuclear war was a very real concern. That said, it's worth noting that of all the condolences that poured in from around the world, many came from communist nations, and nations typically not so friendly to the United States. French journalist Jean Daniel wrote about listening to news reports while sitting in Cuba beside Fidel Castro. Castro was reportedly outraged at what he viewed as the graphic, gratuitous treatment of Jackie Kennedy in particular, and made it clear that previous anti-Kennedy comments he'd made were now off the record. According to the Cuban leader, they were now just comments disagreeing with various U.S. policies. Meanwhile, reports flooded into the New York Times about countries like Algeria, where even the loudest pro-communists reached out to American communities to share their sympathies. Representatives from Iran and Turkey sent messages of grief and support. Panama observed moments of silence, and Berlin came to a halt on both sides of the wall. When the Soviet Union's premier Nikita Khrushchev heard the news, he openly cried as Moscow too came to a halt. Harvard professor Frederick Logevall explained to the Washington Post, "People struggle to comprehend that the American president, who seemed to be in the prime of his life and who was such a global icon, was dead." After President Kennedy's assassination, things happened very quickly. A massive funeral was arranged based on the funeral of another assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln. But while JFK initially lay in state in the East Room of the White House, the public viewing didn't happen until his casket was moved to the Capitol. Once there, around 250,000 people filed past to pay their respects. The president's funeral service and burial were held on November 25th, 3 days after his murder. As for the birthday, that was also November 25th. That was the day John F. Kennedy Jr. turned 3 years old. As his father's coffin went by, John saluted. The moment was captured in one of the most iconic photos of the time. Photographer Dan Farrell later said, "It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen in my whole life. I'm just glad my emotions didn't take over when I was trying to take the picture." The day before, as Lee Harvey Oswald was being moved by Dallas police, they were approached by local nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Ruby, who was well known to local authorities for several reasons, shot and killed Oswald. It was the first murder to be broadcast live on television. Oswald was buried on the same day as JFK, November 25th. There were no doubts that it was Jack Ruby who shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. As police took him to the ground, he yelled, "You all know me, I'm Jack Ruby." Ruby was arrested and put on trial, where his attorney came up with a bizarre defense. The defense argued that Ruby suffered from psychomotor epilepsy. They claimed Ruby blacked out before he shot Oswald and therefore hadn't been aware of or in control of his actions. Ruby, meanwhile, said that he killed Oswald to save Jackie Kennedy from the pain of a trial. Needless to say, Ruby was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. In 2010, one of the jurors, Jay Wayman Rose, came forward with his memories of the trial, which he'd recorded in a journal at the time. At one point, he wrote, "As the days progressed, I could tell that this man was slowly, day by day, dying inside." He went on to write, "There was never any doubt that, number one, he was sane. There was no doubt that it was premeditated, that he planned to do this. But there was some doubt as to intent on what he was doing." The verdict was overturned on appeal based on the fact that it was found to have been an unfair trial, but Ruby was never retried. In December of 1966, he was hospitalized with pneumonia, diagnosed with lung cancer, and died on January 3rd of the following year. It took 1 week for America's new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to appoint and authorize the Warren Commission to thoroughly investigate Kennedy's murder. Did you kill the president? According to a 1972 interview with Commission head Chief Justice Earl Warren, Johnson had major concerns about the state of the world and the potential repercussions of the assassination. Warren said, "Johnson told me he felt conditions around the world were so bad at the moment that he thought it might even get us into a war, a nuclear war." The Warren Commission's conclusions were released 10 months later, and they've been controversial ever since. In a nutshell, they found that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he and Jack Ruby hadn't known each other, and that the right-wing extremists that had seemed pretty suspicious in hindsight were insignificant in the end. In the decades that followed, there's been a voluminous amount of research into the workings of the Warren Commission. In 2013, Philip Sheenan spoke with CBS News around the release of his book, A Cruel and Shocking Act, The Secret History of the Kennedy Assassination. He said that he'd found some facts that indicated not all was as it seemed.
I know what it is to kill someone. You don't bounce and come this way. When you bounce and come this way, you got hit in the front.
These facts included confirmation from the FBI and CIA that they'd known at the time that Oswald was a threat, and that the commission overlooked key parts of his story, including the time he spent in Mexico.
So what really happened that day? Let's just for a moment speculate, shall we?
There are a shocking number of conspiracy theories surrounding John F. Kennedy's assassination. They range from the plausible, that there was a second gunman, to the wildly implausible, no, it probably wasn't aliens who shot the president. And yes, according to Mark Fenster, author of Conspiracy Theories, Secrecy and Power in American Culture, there are more than a few ET-involved assassination theories. In fact, Vincent Bugliosi, author of Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, told the Daily Beast, "At one time or another, conspiracy theorists have accused 42 groups, 8 assassins, and 214 people by name of being involved in the assassination."
It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle. It's not an enigma.
To be fair, it's easy to see how the official findings of the Warren Commission could be too neat and tidy to be the full story. The outcry started with a few books published in 1966, including Rush to Judgment, a critique of the Warren Commission's inquiry into the murders of President John F. Kennedy, Officer J.D. Tippit, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Although conspiracy theories have typically involved organizations like the mob, the U.S. government, and, bizarrely, aliens, new ones keep popping up and are emerging decades after the assassination. In 2016, Donald Trump claimed that Senator Ted Cruz's father was a known associate of Oswald's, a claim that began with the National Enquirer and was based on a photo of an unidentified man. When factcheck.org looked into it, they said that no one should be getting their news from the National Enquirer. The findings of the Warren Commission remain incredibly controversial. In some, they pretty much blamed everything on Lee Harvey Oswald and found no evidence of a conspiracy. But the commission also looked intensively at the Secret Service agents that were there that day. When it was noted that they all followed procedures but the president still died, it led to a massive overhaul of the agency. As noted by the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, the commission concluded the Secret Service was understaffed and underfunded and thus unable to complete its mission of security to the best possible standard. This led to a massive expansion of the agency's personnel and budget, along with steps like getting rid of open-topped cars. And there were other changes. Presidents used to walk through streets and cities largely unaccompanied. It used to be a surprisingly common sight pre-Kennedy. The extension of post-presidential protection to Jackie Kennedy also changed how former first families were protected. And when it comes to rules about whether or not the Secret Service has to listen to presidential requests, they don't. Not, at least, if they think it will expose their charge to danger. Hard lessons were learned from the Kennedy assassination, and decades later it remains among the most famous, most controversial, and most dramatic events in American history.